Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this week's session for our virtual Lenten series. It's great to have you with us, and we've got a full complement. Janina is with us, and Mary and myself. So we're really looking forward to sharing with you our understanding of the readings for this coming week. As we always do, we have an acknowledgement of country, such a precious thing for us to do. So we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we gather today. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Our prayer for today, as we have had during this series. Jesus, the Spirit hurried you from the Jordan River to the desert, and then in Galilee to preach the coming of the kingdom. May this Spirit stir in our hearts too, to hear your call to us in turn to draw to you the people whom we meet in the silence of a peaceful heart, by the gentle hands of friendship, by the faithfulness of presence, by the courage to stick by the despised, and by the match between our words and our lives. May we follow you along the winding road that curls through joy and sadness, through delight and disappointment, and through death with you to life with you forever. Amen. So welcome once again, and we just hand you over to Janina. Thank you.
So this week's reading, I think, is a very beautiful reading from the book of Jeremiah. It's a little shorter than the numbers you see on the screen, but I've pinched the picture. So the essential key word in this text that we're going to read is covenant, and it's a new covenant. So I'd like to look back a little bit. During this Lent, we've already been reading about different covenants. And I know in the, I think, first week, Mary Reaburn said something also about the other covenants. So I just want to go back on them just a little bit. So there are different covenants in the Old Testament. In reading order, the first one is the covenant with Noah and with all flesh, with every created living being. And that's an unconditional promise by God. No conditions. Then we have a covenant with Abraham and with Abraham's family. And that's God's promise that requires a sign, and it requires Abraham's trust, but it's still more God's doing than on the human part. And we have the covenant at Mount Sinai through Moses, the Israelite people, so part of Abraham's descendants. And God there commits to taking care of them. They become God's chosen people, God's possession, more in a special way. God owns everything if you want, but they become God's people in a very special way. God will take care of them, give them the land. In turn, the people commit to keeping God's laws, God's instructions. And they are there because they teach to live in right relationships with each other and with God. So we read the 10 commandments, the 10 words earlier in Lent. So this latter covenant at Sinai is a bilateral agreement, if you want. It can therefore be broken by either party. No created being can break the covenant with Noah. That's just God's thing. But the Sinai covenant can be broken by the human partners. And the events of the Babylonian exile, which we talked about last week, were interpreted by Jeremiah, Ezekiel, other exilic figures as the covenant being broken. So it's on this background that the book of Jeremiah speaks on a new covenant. It refers mainly to the covenant of Sinai and to the fact that Jeremiah and others reckon this covenant was broken by the humans, not by God, but by the human covenant partner. So how is this covenant new? And Jeremiah spells out both how it is new and how it is not new, continuity and discontinuity. I'll read it, but I'll use a different translation to what you will hear, a more literal one, so I can show you a little more details. So it says, look here, days are coming, that's pretty imminent. Days are coming, oracle of the Lord, when I will make with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah a new covenant. Not like the covenant which I made with their ancestors, when I seized their hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. The verse continues, we stop here for a moment. This new covenant, therefore, is not like the one on Sinai, the one during the Exodus. Why not? Because that one could be broken. And we see that as the verse continues. It's a very strange sentence structure, if you want, but it's made so it contrasts two behaviors. So it's not like that covenant which they, let's emphasize, they broke my covenant. So in case you missed it, covenant is doubled. It doesn't need to be there grammatically, but it's there twice. Not like that covenant because they broke my covenant. Though I, God, I had married them. You'll hear different translations. I was their husband, I was their master. I married them. Something that started in the past, that's still going though. It's not all in the past. That verb can also mean I took possession of them. So it's not a marriage in sort of romantic sense, but there is a sense of disappointment in this verse and of bewilderment, as if God is trying to fathom, why on earth did they walk out on me? I tried to do everything. Wait, what happened? So this new covenant is different, first of all, because it will not be broken that easily. Now, the next question is how? Continue. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, oracle of the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their hearts I will write it. So what does not change is the content of the covenant. My law, my instructions, my teaching, my Torah. The new covenant is not about a new law. God's instructions for an adequate behavior, inadequate social structures for the people of God, those have not changed. And as on Mount Sinai, God's instructions are delivered in writing and in God's own handwriting. There's only two places where in the Old Testament where God is said to write God's law, and that's the one we just read, and in Exodus 24:12, which you have on the screen, and that's when Moses goes up Mount Sinai and comes back with God's Torah written by God on stone tablets. Now, those stone tablets were broken just a few weeks later because of the golden calf incident. People were not faithful. So this new covenant is about healing that broken relationship, if you want, and it will last, God's hope, because it will be written directly onto people's hearts, inside, not outside of them. Now, you might know that the Hebrew idea of heart is broader than in English. It's not just the emotional part of oneself, but also the rational, everything that's inside a person. So writing on people's hearts will mean every single Judean, hopes God, will reason with God's law in mind. God's word will have a say in the way they speak, they think, they act, they take decisions. It will also be at the heart of family life, of society, of politics, also as a community. And that not just on solemn days or during prayer time, but what you have on your heart remains, always. The result? I will be their God, and they will be my people. That's the covenant formula. That's ratifying that there is a covenant. And the effects are described again by a contrast. We have, in the next verse, we have 2 times no more or no longer, that frame to 4 because. So no longer or no more shall they teach one person their neighbor, another one their relative, saying, know the Lord. 4, because all of them will know me, from the least of them to the greatest, oracle of the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no longer, no more. So no more need for teaching each other, because every single Judean will already know God from within. How's that possible? Because I, God, will forgive their iniquity. And therefore their sin will be remembered no longer. So it does that sequence. There are other parts in that same chapter that speak about consequences this might have in terms of return and new life. But in these verses, the focus is fully on one central change, that God's instructions, God's word enters so deeply into people's minds and hearts that acting according to them becomes second nature. And then the covenant will not be broken. Now, careful though, because this new covenant, it's important to keep in mind, is all God's doing. It's not a moral imperative, sort of make more of an effort to keep the law, but it's about God doing something. If you look at this verse, the only thing that the people are doing, or the only verb that says what about the people, is they will know me. That's not an action, that's a state of being. And in Hebrew, to know is never just sort of cognitive abstract book knowledge, but it's knowing by experience, knowing with all your senses, knowing from within. And sometimes, I thought sometimes we might take it for granted that we know God. Of course, we're Christians, we go to church, we know God. And of course, we know him better than those people in the Old Testament. But I thought it's a question worth asking. How well do we know God? And not in an abstract sense, but in an existential one. Does our knowledge of God, our relationship with God, therefore, reach our innermost being? Or does it remain somewhat outside of us? Does it have an impact on the way we live, on the way we think? Does it shape the way we live, not individually only, but as a community, as a family, as a society, as church? And as I was thinking that, I was reminded of a text that I know very well, that I'd like to paraphrase quoting at the end. It's not a biblical text, it's a text by Yarra, who was the founders of the movement I'm part of. And it just fits, so you'll forgive me for citing that. So she says, God is not in us like a crucifix that at times may hang on a classroom wall, almost like a talisman. God lives in us, if we let him, as the maker of every law, be it human or divine, because all is God's making. And from within us, his orders come, his commandments. God, the eternal teacher, teaches us both the eternal and the things of this world, and to all he gives value. So I thought it was that the Jeremiah text on that was a beautiful thought to continue our Lenten journey with. And I'll hand over to Mary.
Thank you very much, Janina. It is a beautiful reading from Jeremiah, and I'm so glad you opened it up for us in that way. Thank you. So now we move to the Psalm, and as it's the 5th Sunday of Lent, it's Psalm 51, or Psalm 50 in Catholic lectionaries, but it's the same psalm. In the Hebrew, it's Psalm 51. And our response is, create a clean heart in me, O God. And again, heart, as Janina has said, encompasses a lot more. It's heart and mind and will and our decision making. It includes all of that. It's all that makes us who we are. So it's a much wider concept than our English concept of heart. And that's what's being asked here in the refrain, create a clean heart in me, O God. And we'll look at the word to create. It's the same as in Genesis 1, where God creates the world. So it's that dynamic. Last week, Chris talked about God almost being a poem writer. And, you know, this is the creative act of God, and that's what is creating in us a clean heart. So this psalm begins, have mercy on us, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your hesed. And it has a superscription. This psalm has a superscription or a heading, which probably is later than the psalm itself, but it shows how the tradition had associated particular psalms with particular events in the life of David. And so this superscription reads, to the leader or to the choir master, a psalm of David. And then this is the particularity for this psalm. When the prophet Nathan came to him, to David, after he had gone into Bathsheba, after he had had an extramarital affair with Bathsheba, and as a result of that, had Bathsheba's husband killed. So it's quite a dramatic setting that the superscription creates for this psalm. And just to remind us, verse 6 is quoted in Romans chapter 3. So this psalm too is a lament, and we've had a lot of laments as we have gone along in this season of Lent. But this is a lament which is lamenting personal sin or personal transgression against God or personal movement from God's ways. And so the psalmist recognizes her or his own sin, own divergence from God's path, God's ways. It is one of the penitential psalms. And the penitential psalms are laments, not where someone is stamping their foot at God and saying we're innocent, or asking God to deliver them from enemies, but penitential psalms are laments where the penitent is recognizing his or her own fault or wrongdoing or sin. And that the pain in these laments is almost the pain of self-knowledge, of my having strayed from God's ways. So this lament doesn't have blame of others. It doesn't have enemies walking around in it. It doesn't even have any unanswered questions. It's a psalm of where the self is naked before God, where the self is standing there unencumbered before God. And the emphasis too in this psalm on God. God here is kind and one who washes away guilt. God is steadfast and a giver of joy. So it's all of God's goodness. It echoes Exodus 34, where there is a long description of who God is. So the God in this psalm it's the welcoming side of God. It's the God, as in Jeremiah, where this God who wants the people's hearts, it wants the heart of the individual and of the community to be at one. So let's pray this psalm together. Mary Coloe, I think, will be our voice of response, but I invite everyone to respond as you feel you can. Have mercy on me, O God, in your kindness. In your compassion, blot out my offence. O wash me more and more from my guilt and cleanse me from my sin.
Create a clean heart in me, O God.
A pure heart create for me, O God. Put a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, nor deprive me of your Holy Spirit.
Create a clean heart in me, O God.
Give me again the joy of your help. With a spirit of fervour sustain me, that I may teach transgressors your ways, and sinners may return to you.
Create a clean heart in me, O God.
And I think in the last section of the responsorial psalm, we see the fervour of the person who knows that they have been forgiven by God and they want to teach transgressors God's ways and help sinners to return to God. And that is someone who's given up smoking can be a very strong anti-smoking advocate. So it's that sort of feel that we get, the intensity of knowing that they are forgiven. They want to teach others about it. And maybe we have to practice a little bit of restraint in that regard. So just to look at the whole psalm very briefly, the first 9 verses are more about the confession of guilt, with a focus on the mercy and steadfast love and abundant mercy of God. And in the confession of guilt, it's like we're hearing one side of a dialogue. The person standing before God, and we only hear the penitent's or the person's voice. But we can imagine the response of God, even if it's a welcoming silence, that's part of the dialogue there. And then the second half of the psalm, verses 10 to 19, have an anticipation of a future and has petitions that imply hope, a great hope. And I just want to note here in verse 10, create a clean heart in me, O God. And it's the same verb as in Genesis 1, where God creates the whole of life. And that's what God is creating or recreating in the person, is the life force. Allow me to be my full potential. So it's a beautiful, beautiful psalm. So as I said, this psalm is one side of a dialogue. And in the dialogue, the psalmist, the person whose side we hear, really they're inviting self-transformation as they speak to God. You know, it's the I, thou again, the you, speaking directly to God, but inviting a self-transformation. And I think that's very much what Lent invites us to, a self-transformation before our God, not apart from God, but before our God, and in communion with our God, really. So it in some ways, we're imagining a dialogue with self, with God, and with others for the sake of a clean heart or a clean being and a new and right spirit. So just to talk about this psalm a little bit as it relates to Lent, this psalm in many ways calls us to self-knowledge, even of our failings or our shadow side or the less than perfect part of us. So it calls us, invites us into this self-knowledge. And this self-knowledge is faced best with God. Sometimes it's hard to know myself, to know oneself. But with God, that's possible. And even in knowing my shortcomings and my sin, to take the next step into God really. So we may not be like King David, a murderer and an adulterer. Our sins may be less obvious and less serious, but they are all calls to grow and to be open to the potential that God has put within us. So just finally, each of the readings, and I think each one of them ponders an hour. In Jeremiah, the hour of the new or renewed covenant, that God is there and God is taking an initiative there. In Psalm 51, the hour of self-knowledge before and with God. In Hebrews, the grace of Jesus's hour. And then in John, Jesus's hour has come. So thank you, and I'll turn over to Chris now.
Thanks, Janina and Mary. It's been really instructive so far, and to think about the themes that are embedded in the readings and about renewal, which is so much a part of the Lenten journey. That possibility to start again, and as Janina was talking about, knowing God from within. And it's not only God's heart, but our heart. And there's that idea that you picked up, obviously, in the responsorial psalm for this coming Sunday, about beginning anew, about taking a look at ourselves before God and being given that opportunity to come back home. And that's so much a part of our Lenten journey. And I'd like, Mary, the way you were talking about the person being naked before God. And I think that invites us into what's there in the reading from Hebrews, because we actually see Jesus himself, Son though he is, High Priest though he is, being the one who shares in our situation, if you like, all heart. So we'll move into having a look at that. So one of the things about the letter to the Hebrews, it stresses Jesus' divinity, the beginning of Hebrews. But in these days, last days, God has spoken to us by a Son, whom God appointed heir of all things, through whom God also created the worlds. So that's a very highly exalted understanding of the person of Jesus. And I think it's worth holding that in mind and in our hearts, because Jesus is going to, despite all that, enter very deeply, profoundly into our experience. This exalted language that's there at the beginning of Hebrews, that he, that it's Jesus, is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. So we've got this extraordinary act of grace, isn't it? That this one, this word, this Son, higher than the angels, as the letter to the Hebrew begins, becomes one like us. So one of the things I think that we need to reflect on from Hebrews is that Hebrews gently holds Jesus' divinity and humanity and honors them both. And one of the things in our Christian journey in theology over the centuries is, how do we actually hold that reality of Jesus being truly divine and truly human? And at different times we emphasize one or the other, and sometimes at the cost of the other. Just before our section that we have for this coming Sunday, Hebrews talks about Jesus as our compassionate high priest. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. So he knows our experience from within. So let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So Jesus is praying for us, and he's able to gently deal with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. In other words, that's the world in which he lives. That's the world in which he enters, our world. So our reading for this coming Sunday. During his life on earth, Christ offered up prayers and entreaty, aloud and in silent tears, to the one who had the power to save him out of death. And he submitted so humbly that his prayer was heard. Although he was Son, he learnt to obey through suffering. But having been made perfect, or it might be and being made perfect, he became for all who obey him the source of eternal salvation. So there are a few questions in a text like this. When are the loud cries offered? And for whom? Did Jesus pray to be delivered from death? And if his prayers were heard, how come he dies on a cross? Is he saved from having to die or being saved out of death by the resurrection? These are the questions that occupy biblical scholars as they try to explore this text and its meaning. So often we look to a text and we think we understand what it's saying, but there are a number of questions that this particular text gives rise to. So many people have interpreted the text as talking about, well, this is describing obviously Jesus in the garden and on the cross, as we hear in the Synoptic Gospels. So Hebrews is written much later than the Synoptic Gospels. So I think it's reasonable to assume that the author to the Hebrews is well aware of Jesus' agony in the garden and on the cross as he wrestles and prays that God's will might be done and that the cup might pass him by, as we have in Mark's Gospel. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus cries and prays that God might forgive his enemies. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus dies with a scream, a cry of abandonment. And finally, in the Synoptic Gospels, he puts his life into God's hands, praying the words from Psalm 31. Of course, Mary will be speaking about John's Gospel, which takes another line when it comes to these realities. But I think most people have understood the letter to the Hebrews as describing these prayers and entreaties of being Jesus in the garden, Jesus on the cross. So most scholars would say that Jesus is saved out of death, but not from it. It seems very obvious because Jesus died on a cross, didn't he? So he offered up prayer and entreaty, aloud and in silent tears, to the one who had the power to save him out of death. And he submitted so humbly that his prayer was heard. So remembering that for the author to the letter to the Hebrews that Jesus is high priest, Jesus prays not only for himself, but for us. And in our most desperate moments, he continues to pray with and for us. So let's not just isolate his prayers to what happened in the past, but Jesus still being with us on our journey in our moments of weakness when we're struggling to find our way back home. So it's a profound text because it talks about how Jesus learned obedience. Although he was Son, he learned to obey through suffering. Of course, this is a phrase that confronts modern readers. This passage reveals how early Christians understood with greater clarity than we do sometimes the extraordinary gift of Jesus' humanity. Although he was Son, he learnt. No safety net for him, no travel insurance for a visit to humanity. All or nothing, and all for love. That's the good news, isn't it? So learning and suffering. Within the Greco-Roman world, there was the maxim, to suffer is to learn. And I'm sure many of us who are teachers have we've all been students somewhere along the line, and sometimes learning is not the easiest thing we've ever had to do. But it was often used to describe the educative process in the Greco-Roman world. Learning involved discipline and punishment for not listening or learning. I can remember some of the punishments we received learning Latin in high school. One mistake you could get away with, 2 mistakes, oh, you were right on the edge. 3rd mistake, out came the strap. So that didn't really endear me to the learning of Latin, but I overcome that in time, years later. But Hebrews does not see Jesus as a slow or distracted pupil. What it wants to describe, though, is Jesus sharing in our human experience. I just want to contrast it with the infancy gospel of Thomas, was written somewhere between the 3rd and 6th century. So it describes Jesus as a child. He was a child prodigy. So he's showing his great learning. He had 3 teachers and they all go away feeling disconsolate because he knows more about things than they do. And the Jews cried out and said to him, "Oh, new and incredible wonder. The child is perhaps 5 years old, and oh, what words he says. We've never known such words. No one, neither a lawyer nor a Pharisee, has spoken like this child." And Zechariah, who teaches him, says, "Friends, I ponder my shame, an old man that I am, that I've been defeated by a child. I should be cast out and die or flee this village because of this child. I can't be seen any longer among everyone, especially when they saw they've been defeated by this child." So this is Jesus' great learning. But this is not the point that Hebrews wants to say. Jesus learns obedience through the things that he suffers. It's not a sign of imperfection, it's a sign of his sharing. So Herodotus would have said, "While sufferings are unwelcome to me, they've become my lessons." So Jesus is presented as one who learns obedience in the midst of suffering, because actually this is what the reader of Hebrews is called to do, you and me, learn in the midst of our life experience. So Jesus learned and modeled obedience. Suffering was the incubator in which his obedience grew, not an obstacle to it. So having been made perfect, he became for all who obey him the source of eternal salvation. So the perfection that is spoken of here is to have arrived at the goal of the journey. Jesus has completed the journey laid out for him. He is this way made perfect. God has been at work in him, and this is our task in Lent, as Janina reminded us, to bring God into the very core of our being. As Mary reminded us to acknowledge who we are and our need for God. Giving God room to work in the midst of our joys and sorrows too. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Chris. This week, the 5th week of Lent, we start John chapter 12, verse 20. And there's a lot we've missed. So we haven't read chapter 11 during this season of Lent. Other seasons we do. So I need to just say something about what's just happened, or you won't make sense of what's going on in next Sunday. So in John 11, Jesus calls Lazarus from the grave, called back into life. And because of that, John writes, many Jews came to believe in Jesus. So that's good. At the end of chapter 11, Jewish crowds are gathering to Jesus. And then, at the start of chapter 12, Jesus crosses over from Bethany on one side of Mount Olives, over the hill, down into Jerusalem. And a great crowd come out to greet him, waving palm branches and calling out, "Hosanna, blessings on the King of Israel." This, you remember, is what we'll celebrate on Palm Sunday. Well, when the Pharisees saw the crowd coming out to Jesus and calling him a king, this caused great fear, because they were afraid that Jesus would spark a mass rebellion against Rome. So much so that they continue, and the questions raised, what are we going to do about this man? If we let Jesus go on like this, everyone will believe in him. The Romans will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. But Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You do not understand. It's better to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." And that's the situation, I think, that happened in Russia. Alexei Navalny. He was the voice of opposition in a country that could not afford to have a popular uprising. So, while the crowd are hailing Jesus as King of Israel, the evangelist, and you'll hear it next Sunday in the Palm Sunday readings, the evangelist adds comments from two prophets, Zephaniah and Zechariah, that expand that vision. "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion." And Zephaniah then continues, and we don't get this next Sunday, "My decision is to gather the nations." And then next Sunday you'll hear, "Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." And of course, if you're a Jewish person, you know what comes next in Zechariah. This king will command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, from the rivers to the ends of the earth. So there's an expansion from a national to a universal outlook. Now, at this point, some Greeks, so this is what we hear this Sunday. Among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks, and they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." So Philip went and told Andrew, and then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. See, the Passover was so great, a festival, that a crowd of not only Jews has come to Jerusalem, but also Gentiles, non-Jews. In today's reading, they're simply called Greeks. They go to two of Jesus' disciples who have Greek names. So Andrew and Philip are Greek names. And this group of Greeks represent what the Pharisees have just said. You see, the whole world has gone after him. And it's the coming of the Greeks representing that whole world outlook that Jesus recognizes. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. So the coming of the Greeks has triggered this response in Jesus. The Jewish thinking at the time is what we have to understand. That at the end of time, the nations would gather to Jerusalem at the end time. So we see from Zephaniah, "My decision is to gather nations. Then all the speech of the people will be changed. All of them may call on the name of the Lord." Zephaniah and Isaiah also, "Arise, shine out, that your light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen on you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn." So when the nations, represented by the Greeks, come to Jesus, there's this recognition that the end time has come. The end time has come. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now, remember last week we talked about the fact that to be exalted, to be lifted up, has a double meaning. Yes, it means to be glorified, but it also carries with it the image of being lifted up on the cross. So it's a double image, this being glorified. And Jesus speaks of the Son of Man that we heard last week. This Son of Man that announces the end of time, the ending of the powers of evil. And so this leads Jesus then to reflect on his coming death. So speaking about being glorified, now Jesus speaks about death. And he uses the image of a seed. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it. Those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternity life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honour. Now, this image of a grain of wheat falling into the ground and dying is an understanding that once the seed is in the soil, it begins to germinate. So it begins to lose its shape, its form. So in a sense, the seed is dying, even as it's germinating new life. Chris has talked about this human struggle, and we get a glimpse of that this week in the Gospel of John. Now my soul is troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is the reason that I've come to this hour. Okay? Think of Alexei Navalny. He actually returned to Russia after he spent some time in England. He must have known what was going to happen, and he must have had similar anguish and questions. Now my soul is troubled. But in this time of trouble, Jesus is consoled by the voice of his Father. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. Now the crowd only heard thunder and a noise. Somebody said, an angel's spoken to him. And Jesus says, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. I see this voice, a bit like the baptismal voice, as an inner personal experience of Jesus in his time of distress, struggle, to experience a presence of God offering encouragement and consolation. With the Father's voice, though, something big has happened. We started off with national hopes that Jesus was the King of Israel. And then with the coming of the Greeks, that hope expands to be for all people. But now the heavens have spoken, which raises it to a cosmic conflict. This isn't just a struggle between the Jews and Rome. This is a cosmic struggle. And Jesus says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. He said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. So again, this is Jewish thinking, that this world is dominated by an evil power called in John the ruler of this world. And for the Christians, they saw in Jesus a struggle between goodness and evil. The power of God's love is a power that can drive out, overcome the evil. There's no longer any need to be stuck in sort of tendencies that make us less than who we can be. The gift of love that Jesus brings, the love in freely laying down his life, can defeat this power. Last week, you might remember this image. And I talked about the inner fight that goes on inside all of us between the person we want to be, our best self, and sometimes the person that we act out of, our worst self. But even when we're in that time of despondency, feeling the worst of ourselves, if we can let God in, there is the possibility of growing beyond our own pettiness. Grace is a reality. It's a possibility if we want it. I know when I get stuck, when I feel there's nothing I can do, I know that if I open myself to God and beg for grace, beg for God's power, then something about God's grace gets inside and melts that hard iciness I sometimes know within. So Jesus says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. That's us. We're part of that, being lifted up with Jesus. And Jesus dies in John in love, the Father's love for the world. So this week we are moving closer to the lifting up of Jesus, his cross, the accomplishing of his mission, a mission to reveal the utmost power of God's love for us, and to demonstrate in him that the powers of evil have been defeated by love. Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you very much,
And
Mary.
I left the ads to you, David.
Oh, that's quite all right. There's only one question, I think, Chris, that I saw.
About Herodotus, yeah?
Yeah. So I'm not sure who wants to take that one.
Well, since I quoted him, I think it's probably only fair that I should say that he and Thucydides, who's another Greek name there, are famous for being writing the first, I suppose, what would we think about in terms of modern histories. In terms of they described in the 5th century the war between Sparta and Athens, known as the Peloponnesian War, and so they were both historians. As it turned out, they were both buried side by side. So it's two great figures, and known, I suppose, as great figures of learning. And in order to write those histories, as they did, it involved a great deal of suffering and research. It wasn't a matter of just sort of jumping into cars and going from one place to another, or buses or trains. They had to move around, walk around, ask people, sift through the data and everything. I think that's why Herodotus was talking about how sometimes the art of learning can be a painful or suffering journey. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, if anyone wants to follow that up, there's a fascinating book on Thucydides called Thucydides, the Artful Reporter. And it shows that even back then, reporters weren't writing objective what happened, but they were propaganda. They were writing about events, but events couched in a way that everyone knew what was going to happen. There was no question who was going to win this battle by the way it was told in so-called history. So, great book.
Yeah, no, and quite right, Mary. One of the things that what they would have said about the history writing, they'd say, because they report a lot of speeches, but they'd say, look, some of the speeches I heard, some of them I wrote that what would be appropriate to the circumstance, and sometimes what I thought they should have said. It's like one of our priests, I think I might have mentioned one time, who said about, yes, what Jesus meant to say. And we thought, oh, well, it's great that you've got that sort of inside knowledge about what Jesus would have said if he was with us. But Yes, but that was ancient history writing. That was the way of it. Yeah. So yeah.
Chris,
So that's a yep.
There's another question there from Michael Smith. Please confirm, I'm not sure that's the right word, the author and audience of the letter to the Hebrews.
Okay.
So the
Well,
author
let me
and
tell
the
you.
audience.
Okay.
The second
Author
is probably
unknown.
easier.
Yeah. No. Author unknown. Really. While it's been attributed in tradition to Paul, the language is not. I mean, in the Greek, it's clearly someone else. That's okay. But as I was told when I first went to study the letter to the Hebrews in Rome, I was by Benoit, when he started the class, he said, well, I'm here to tell you that 1, it wasn't written by Paul, 2, it wasn't a letter, and 3, it wasn't written to Hebrews, in the sense that it's written to Christians trying to explore, for Jewish Christians, trying to explore who Jesus is within their frame of reference.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. We're
There's
running.
comment on in the chat. Worth viewing Benedict Cumberbatch reading one of the last letters of Navalny on YouTube. Wow, that would be precious.
And very powerful, I'm sure.
And it ties in with what we're going to hear on Sunday about the struggle. You know, and I think tonight we've heard it from Janina, from Mary, from Chris, and then from myself. There's very human struggle that's just part of being human, making decisions in difficult times.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and and difficult decisions themselves as well. You know, even for Jesus, but certainly for us, the decisions about our knowledge of ourselves and the transformation of ourselves, they're difficult decisions. They're not easy to come by. We can say we want them, but when it becomes the reality of wanting them, and that's I think why the psalmist calls on all the sides of God that the psalmist wants God to show forth when speaking. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks,
I'm very conscious of time. We try to limit these sessions to 1 hour. Just a couple of points, if I may. I do sound like a broken record on the chat, but if you haven't already included your details for the purpose of teacher accreditation, please do so now in the chat. Your name, your email, preferably the one that you used to register, your name of your school, ideally, and also your VIT or teacher number. Only myself and the panelists can see that detail, just so you know. Just on accreditation, there is quite a bit of work for our team at Garratt to tee up your accreditation details over the 6 weeks. I can't believe we're already 5 weeks in, with 1 week to go. But over that period of time, there is a bit of admin work for us. So we will communicate with you after these sessions and look to issue certificates in April. So there's been a couple of questions about that through the chat. I also would encourage you, and we put the details in the email of the video that we send out every Friday. If you haven't seen the video from last week, it included Mary's session with the PowerPoint, because we had a few technical hiccups. So Mary Coloe kindly redid the video and we spliced and diced the video. So if you wish to watch that again, that's available on the Garratt website as well. So so we will send out the video on Friday. with some ads. If you can, I know it's very tight, but if any of the speakers tonight, all of them have some fantastic resources, and I've peppered a few ads through the chat as I do, to encourage you to support the work and support Garratt if you can. I know times are tough. And also we place a little advertisement for YTU, because Janina and Mary and Chris don't get paid for these sessions. They do it out of the goodness of their heart and their desire to help you on a Lenten journey. I know that they're very pleased to do that, and we're very pleased that you can and want to join these sessions, and we're very pleased to put them on. But we will put a little ad with YTU's bank account. So if you can give $5 or $5,000, I'm sure Chris would be delighted either way. Any small gift is helpful. Some people have started to ask my team at Garratt if they can donate to Garratt Publishing. We do not take donations. We're a commercial provider. If you wish to donate for these sessions,
I will.
Then please donate to YTU instead. So just so that we're clear on that. With that, I think, unless there's any other questions come through the chat as I was ranting away, I don't think there was. We can call it a night, and wherever you may be, I do hope that you have a blessed week ahead. All good fortune to you. I hope lots of good things happen to you. And we will see you again Monday night next week for, believe it or not, the last session. So thank you, Mary. Thank you, Janina, coming to us all the way from chilly Germany, from Chris and Mary Coloe as well. Thank you so much. And have a good evening.
Good.
Have a lovely evening.
Thanks.
Blessings, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.